Hi there, thanks for watching this presentation. My name is Dr. Toby Coe and I'm the Technical Director at Fishtek Consulting. I'll be talking about the background to the fish pass design choices we made on the river in terms of the fish passes that were built for the Unlocking the Severn project. So the talk outline is really around these four large weirs towards the bottom of the river. So in the schematic on the right hand side here, you can see that they're focused around the area just upstream from the River Team. So Worcester is about here at Diglas Weir. And then we have the three other weirs upstream, which are Beverley, Holt and Lincoln. The talk will be focused really around the fundamentals of fish pass design. So questions like, where do we build the fish pass? How big should it be? And from that matter, how much water should it take? What type of fish pass do we need? And what should the internal details of that fish pass look like? And in terms of specificity within these questions, we're really starting at a very high level in terms of, well, where do we build the fish pass? And then we're working down towards more detailed questions like, what do the internal hydraulics of the fish pass look like? And how are we going to engineer the fish pass to get those hydraulics? So in the first instance, the big question of where, the critical component of fish pass design is probably the most critical component of fish pass design actually, is where you put your fish pass. So if you think about a fish migrating upstream, the first thing it has to do is actually find that fish pass or the entrance to the fish pass before it moves into it. So one of the reasons you see fish passes around the world not functioning very well is quite often because they're in the wrong place. It seems like a very fundamental question, but there are some quite subtle details around where you site a fish pass and where in some cases you're able to site a fish pass that may dictate how well that fish pass operates. It's a bit of an aside, but it's an important concept. So the image I've just put up on the screen is a very large dam and fish pass in South America called a taipu. The fish pass is actually, as far as I'm aware, the largest fish pass in the world. And it's been put forward into the fish pass community, if you like, as being a really good example of a very large fish pass. It's a natural bypass channel for much of its length. It's a concept we'll come on to later. But it actually isn't that efficient. And one of the main reasons I believe, and in conversations with colleagues, I think other people believe, is that the entrance to the fish pass is about 4 kilometers downstream of the dam. So it's a very, very long way from where most of the flow in the river is focused at the dam and powerhouse and the fish pass entrance. So it's not a surprise that fish miss the entrance to the fish pass as they're migrating upstream. So on the River Severn, the question as to where we should build the fish passes was actually relatively easy. And the simple answer for this is that all the weirs that we're concerned about, so the 4 weirs, these are aerial views of those 4 weirs, they're all angled across the flow. So rather than being at 90 degrees to the flow, as many weirs are, they're actually have a clear upstream and downstream end. So you can see this quite clearly here at Diglas Weir. This is the upstream corner of the weir. Flow is coming from top of the image to bottom, and you can see that for fish coming upstream, there's a clear upstream corner. Equally at Holt, it's not quite as pronounced, but for fish coming upstream, they'll eventually end up at this corner. Similarly for Beverley, coming upstream, there's a clear upstream corner here. And at Lincoln is probably the site where it's least clear, but there is still an upstream corner over here. But like I say, it's not quite as pronounced as, for example, at Diglas, where the angle across the flow is quite more substantial. And then moving on to the second question of, well, how big do we make the fish pass? The starting point for us in this project was to use a UK guidance that the fish pass should take 10% of the average flow in the river at Q95. And I'll explain that a little bit. What it means is that Q95 is a term which refers to the graph that you can see now, which is the flow duration curve. And what it means is the Q95 flow is the flow in the river that is exceeded 95% of the time. So the flow is only lower than that for about 5% of the time. So you would expect it to be lower than that for about the driest 2 or 3 weeks of the summer. And what we want is, ideally, a fish pass should take 10% of the average flow when the river is at that particular low flow in the summer. So let's say that the average flow in the river is 100 cubic meters a second, and the Q95 flow is 15 cubic meters per second. Well, when the river has got 15 cubic meters per second in it, if the fish pass is taking 10% of that 100 cubic meters a second, at that low flow, the fish pass will be taking 10 cubic meters per second, 10% of 100 cubic meters a second. And what it means is that at low flows, a fish pass will quite often be taking a very significant proportion of the flow in the river. But then as the river comes up, it takes a gradually smaller proportion of the river until at higher flows, it's actually taking quite a small amount of the flow. And why that's important is that it means it gives you as high a chance as possible that fish will find the fish pass, because you're using a lot of the river in the fish pass, and that creates what is called the attraction flow to the fish pass. And like where you site the fish pass, it's a really critical component of fish pass design. So we use that as our starting point, and for the river at the Severn, at the two sites, the flow gauging sites in close to where we built the fish passes, the Cumene at Bewdley, which is the first, is just upstream of Lincoln. The Cumene there is 61.3 cubic meters per second. Cumene, I'm sorry, is the average flow. And at Worcester, which is the closest gauging site to Diglas and Beverley, the average flow in the river is 72.4 cubic meters per second. So ideally, we would take about 7 cubic meters per second in the two lowest fish passes, and then 6 cubic meters per second in the two upstream fish passes. We're not far off that actually in our final designs. They're slightly less than that. They're about 8% of the average flow in the river at Q95. So we got pretty close. The reason for that slight deviation is because that rule of 10% of the average flow at Q95 is generally applied for smaller sites, and the Severn is a very, very large river. So the next question is, what type of fish pass should we build? So we know where we're going to build it. We know roughly how much water we need it to take. So what type of fish pass should it be? There are many fish passes out there, but the primary determinant factor that we were concerned about for the Unlocking the Severn project was the species of concern, and that is the shad. So the whole project was set up to try and restore runs of shad within the River Severn. This is a photograph of a shad on the right here, and the video I'm about to play is some Alice shad in France, actually just downstream of a hydropower scheme, and you can see that there's quite a lot of fish in this image. The slightly larger fish you can see that's a bit more pale grey, that's a salmon, but the majority of fish there are Alice shad. So this was the species that was had the largest runs on the Severn historically, but is now quite rare, and there are very likely to be very few pure Alice shad in the river. The one in the Severn now is mainly twait with a few hybrid twait Alice shad in there as well. So first question was, well, we need these fish passes to pass shad, so what fish pass should we build? And then there are other factors that help decide the type of fish pass, so the space available, the head loss of the barrier, the access for construction and maintenance, the maintenance liability for the fish pass you're going to build, and the presence of other structures like bridges, retaining walls, and utilities like sewage pipelines. So for the River Severn, the primary factor in question we really needed to address was, will the fish pass or the fish passes allow the passage of shad? So following a literature review or further literature review and discussions with colleagues in France and Portugal and Germany and actually the USA as well, we identified there were essentially two different fish passes that we could use on the River Severn. The first is a deep vertical slot pass. There's an image of this on the left-hand side of the slide now. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this type of fish pass. It's quite common in places like France and the USA, and it's very good for passing a large range of fish species. And the other type of fish pass we could use is a natural bypass channel. So I've got a project around River Severn.
Yeah, making sure that what they're doing is legal, because if we get involved in something that's not legal, then we're going to be in trouble. But we should be supporting them. From a legal standpoint and free swimming, even more complicated.
Bypass channels are quite shallow, but that type of fish pass is highly effective for shad. And then the secondary question, which is which is really very important, is what can we fit in at each of the sites. For the same reason, there's no point designing a fish pass that the fish you are worried about can't use or can't find. Equally, there's no point designing a fish pass that fairly obviously can't be built. So the solution at this phase of the project is determined by the space available, the relative ground levels, and I'll come back to that, and the differential head at the sites. And what I mean by that is the difference between the upstream and downstream water level across the weir. And that was different for the 4 sites. So looking at an aerial shot of each of these fish passes in turn, this is Diglis Weir, which is the lowest weir within the 4 weirs I'm talking about. And it's in Worcester, and you can see that we've got a footpath here alongside the river, extends up there as well. These trees are on a Severn Trent Water Sewage Treatment Works site. And the differential head on this weir is quite high. It's about 2.6 metres in summer flows between the upstream and the downstream water levels. So what we realised was that we didn't have the space here to sit in or build a large meandering natural bypass channel. It would have been very long because of the differential head, and because the difference between the ground level and the water level is quite high, we would have also had to make the channel quite wide in order to have slopes on the side of the fish pass channel above the water level. So we would have had a very large excavation that ran all the way up here across into Severn Trent Water Sewage Treatment Works, and it just wasn't practical to fit it in at this particular site. At Beverley Weir, we had a complete opposite almost, and you can see we've got a very large field alongside the weir. The difference between the ground level and the water level is quite high still, about 5 metres, but the differential head, so the head loss across the weir from upstream to downstream, was quite small at 1.6 metres. So the conclusion from that was that we do have the space to create a larger channel that can come out of the field here. At Holt, you can't really see it in this aerial image, so forgive me, but you will see it on some of the videos online, and if you go to site, you'll definitely notice it. There's a very steep, very large bank here that runs up for 20 or 30 metres and is quite close to the edge of the river. And in addition, the access to this site is very difficult. So the team that built this fish pass did a fantastic job actually building it full stop, because the way that they came into sight was everything came via water, so came in via pontoons or boats. And getting anything in or out was a real challenge. So we were equally limited by the size of the structure that we could build. And at the last site, Lincoln, it's a bit of a medley of the previous. We have got a field here, but actually we're limited by the fact there are holiday chalets here. There's a boat boom here that's fixed into the bank, and the landowner here is different from the landowner here, which brought in some complications at the site. So actually the space we have available is effectively a rectangle here, which means we haven't really got the space to create a large winding channel, which is compounded by the fact that the head loss across the weir at Lincoln is quite high. It's about 2.8 metres at low summer flows. So in terms of the next stage of the project, we decided what we were going to build and where, and the type of fish pass. We did a knowledge gaining exercise when we looked at lots of previous examples. We did more literature reviews, and we also carried out site visits to France, Portugal, and Germany. I've got 3 videos here I'd like to show you. This first one on the left is from France, and it's a really nice rock ramp pass that they've built in a slightly unusual way with these columns of concrete. One of the things I'd like you to look at is that the fact that you've got a cross slope from one side of the fish pass to the other. So the way we just saw the video, from the left-hand side of the video, the fish pass is shallow on that side and then deeper on the side we're now looking at the end of the video. And on the middle video here, this is a rock ramp pass in Portugal, quite similar to that French one. No cross slope, but they use, rather than round boulders, they use square and rectangular boulders, and they use a mixture of both. Now, I'd not seen this before, and when I saw it, I really liked that design because you get these large areas of still water behind the square boulders. And the final video here is a fish pass in France, but this is a vertical slot pass. So this is what a vertical slot pass looks like when it's functioning. This is a double slot pass, so you can see you've got 2 slots. I'm zooming in there to show some debris that's stuck in the fish pass. But other than that, you can see that you've got this quite nice flow that splits between these slots and these still areas alongside the walls behind these nibs, if you like, that stick out from the wall. So, taking that information that we'd seen in other sites, and the decisions we had made as to what we were going to build, what were the key design features? Well, for the vertical slot passes, we had these key design features on the left, and the natural bypass at Beverley, we have these features on the right. I won't go through these all now because this is a recording and you can pause if you like and go through those, but those are the fundamental design features at a more detailed level that we apply to each of the sites. So for the vertical slot passes, what we ended up with on paper, and this is going back to the outline design stage drawings, this is Diglas Weir. You can see the viewing gallery at the upstream end here, which I'm sure many of you have seen videos from. And then we've got the main fish pass, and water is flowing from left here to right. And we've got a series of pools in the fish pass fairly obviously, and these characteristic vertical slot forms with the nibs on the side and then these deep slots. And then at the downstream end, critically, we've got this junction pool. So why this junction pool is important is because when we were doing all the calculations for how these fish passes would function, we realized that if we needed to put all of the flow, so going back to that flow characteristic of ideally 10% of average flow in the river at a Q95 river flow, if we had put all that water in the fish passes, we would have had very, very large, or would have needed very, very large vertical slot passes. So what we did was we, again, took some lessons from fish passes we've seen elsewhere, particularly France, and we added to the design what we call augmentation flow. So you can see here that you have a gallery, down the side of the fish pass, or a channel, and another one here. And what these are intended for is to take water from upstream. The weir is situated about here. Take water from upstream down these galleries on each side, and it then joins the main flow from the fish pass, which is coming out here, joins the main flow from the fish pass, and flows out through a single entrance at the bottom. And this is a zoomed in version of those slots, just to show you that actually the detailing and precision relating to how those slots are formed is quite important, and we made sure to get that right, because how those slots are formed and the angles, relative angles between the different elements of the slot really change the flow characteristics in the fish pass. And there's lots of very good papers that have shown this, and I can share those with anyone who's interested if you want to drop me an email. So these are two videos that show some of the work we did at Southampton University, or Southampton University did for the project rather, that were we've got a physical model built of the fish pass and then put in a flume, and we tested the hydraulic characteristics of the fish pass with dyes. So the first video I'm going to show you here on the left is dye being placed into the fish pass to show the pattern of flow of the fish pass. You see it's got turbine there, and then flows through the slots quite quickly in the linear plume, as it were, and then dissipates and the next pool down. But more importantly, what we really wanted to look at was what is the flow characteristic in the junction pool as water comes from these galleries on the side, flows through the screen into this junction pool here, and then out through the entrance. And what we found, very interestingly, was that as designed, you'll see it very clearly in these dyes, most of the water came out through the downstream quarter to third of the screen only, and not much water came out through the top. And why that's important is because if you have most of the water coming out through just part of the screen, you'll have a much higher velocity through that part of the screen than you would if the flow was distributed around the whole screen. And this is shown in the diagram here on the right, that what we found, and this was done through velocity measurements of water coming through the screen in the model, is that almost all the flow came out right towards the end of the screen. Now we don't want that, because that will essentially encourage fish to try and come up the screen and make their way through the screen. And actually all we want with this water is that it comes out through the screen into this pool, and then all of the water comes out to the end to create a nice attraction flow. So we addressed this issue by installing only stream. And what that does is causes the water to flow out through the screen in a different manner. So we found it was really good at equalising flow out through the screen. So it's coming out all the way along and you're getting much lower velocities across the whole screen. So you're equalising flow through the screen, which means fish won't be drawn up into this or drawn up to try and swim through the screen. And then for the bypass channel, we didn't do as much modelling, but what we did was we looked at some of those fish passes in Portugal with the square blocks, and this was quite late actually in the design process. We'd started this design with round boulders like in France, and we took those lessons from Portugal, and I took some measurements of the fish passes in Portugal, and we used that design approach for every weir, so the natural bypass channel. So what you can see, there's a zoomed in version here, is you've got this mixture of square and rectangular boulders, with the rectangular boulders over towards the true left side of the weir. So this side of the weir here, water is flowing from the upstream end here to downstream. So these rectangular boulders are over near one side. So what we get actually in the fish pass, and you'll see this at site if you go to site, is that you get these quite large still pockets of water behind these boulders, which I really like because I think it gives nice resting areas for fish to sit behind as they're making their way up the fish pass. And on this section view, what you can also see is we took the lessons from some of the French fish passes and we had a crossfall across the river. So one side of the fish pass is higher than the other, which means that for a given water level in the fish pass, you have a greater depth of water on one side than the other, which also means you have a higher velocity of water on one side than the other. And these are the final fish passes. So these are two images. The left-hand image there is of Digler's fish pass, looking down the fish pass, and you can see the attraction flow, augmentation flow gallery down the side here and here between the concrete of the fish pass and the steel piles that form the overall shape of the fish pass structure. And at Beverley here, you can see these really nice mixture of square and concrete boulders. Now, sorry, square and rectangular boulders. Now, it isn't. I mean, some people would argue it's not a natural bypass channel. I would probably agree with them. It is quite heavily engineered, but that was a necessity due to the very high head changes we have on the Severn. You know, this site is completely underwater in winter flood flows. But overall, we're really pleased with the final result, and we've seen a lot of shad going up past the viewing gallery at Digler's Weir, as you'll see on some of the videos online. So I would really encourage you to go onto YouTube and find the channel for the Unlocking the Severn project and have a look at the videos there. There's really nice videos of the opening of each of these two fish passes, as well as lots of videos giving a background for the project and some really good overhead shots of these fish passes within the general setting of the weir and the landscape as well. So thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, please do get in touch. My email's on the screen now, and I would be more than happy to answer any questions.